Today in the EU, Ireland heads to the polls and achieves a relatively high turnout. On the second day of the European elections, the Irish and the Czech went to the polls to decide who they want to represent them in the upcoming European Parliament. While the turnout in Ireland was relatively high, unfortunately the exit polls weren't published, and in Czechia, citizens will be voting today as well. Hello and welcome. I am Evikiori, and this is Today in the EU. But to understand better how the Irish vote, what are the thorny issues and which MEPs may be staying in Brussels, we spoke with Euractiv's editor Donagh Cagney. So, Donagh, we waited for the exit polls last night. However, they didn't make it out on time. But we know that the turnout was relatively high. So, could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, the turnout was about 48% as reported by national media in Ireland. And that varied across the three constituencies that make up the Irish electorate system. In Dublin, the capital city, it was actually down. It was at 42%, but a bit higher in the more rural areas of the Midland Northwest, 50%, and the south of Ireland, slightly above 50%.
Mm-hmm. And, the latest projections regarding Ireland were the most interesting ones. So why is that? What changes did we see this time?
Well, there's no huge shift from right to left or anything like that. But from an Irish perspective, what's quite interesting is that Sinn Féin, which is the main opposition party, left of centre, it's going to do well. It's going to have 3 seats instead of the 1 it got in 2019. But it's not going to do as well as it hoped. And as recently as April, the party was polling to get 6 seats. So this is really going to be quite a disappointment for them if those latest pollings do come to pass. There's a wider context there as well. For quite some years now, Sinn Féin was, as I mentioned, the main opposition party. And there was a kind of a consensus that the current government, which there needs to be a national election by March of next year, was going to be replaced and Sinn Féin was going to be in power in some shape or form. And the leader of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou McDonald, was considered Ireland's next Taoiseach or Ireland's next Prime Minister. Now, if it is the case that they don't perform as well as they thought they would, this kind of throws things up in the air and perhaps it's not quite a fait accompli that Sinn Féin will be leading the next Irish government.
Mm-hmm. Now, how do the Irish vote? There is a differentiation when you compare the voting system to other countries. So how do they vote?
Yeah, there's a few specificities that are worth mentioning in the context of European elections. First of all, voters, they choose an individual, not a party list. There's also a culture where voting in Ireland is quite local, Voters expect their politicians to be available to help them with individual things. And this sometimes gives a sense of clientism, but it also means that politicians need to work to get the votes. So if you're ever in Brussels airport, it's quite frequent that you'll see Irish MEPs waiting at that flight to go back to keep their supporters behind them. Another interesting aspect is that it is proportional representation as well. That means that voters, they vote in descending order for their preferred candidates. They don't just choose one. And when their candidate is either elected or knocked out, their other votes are transferred to other candidates. It's a little bit complicated, but what it basically means is that candidates have an incentive to try and get broad support, not just from one small part of the population. And that tends to reward more moderate politicians who don't alienate other people. So there's some speculation that contributes to more moderate Irish politics as well.
So who do the Irish people tend to vote for?
Well, one feature of the last couple of European elections is that there has been a tendency to vote for independents, so not associated with any political party. And some of these tend to be quite large characters or larger than life characters as well. For example, there was one candidate running in one of the constituencies who very confidently declared that she's not a believer in parliamentary democracy, but she still wants you to vote for her to be elected so she can do a good job for you. There was another politician running on the catchphrase, "Stop the madness," which resonated with a lot of people as well. But it's also led to some politicians which people in Brussels might already be familiar with. For example, Claire Daly and Mick Wallace.
These two examples are precisely what I'm going to be asking you about next.
My name is Claire Daly. I'm an MEP currently for the Dublin constituency. I think these elections take place against the backdrop of a very dangerous time where the European Union is barrelling towards ever-increasing militarisation at a time when we need need much more global cooperation and attention. They're actually taking money from environmental budgets and putting it in defence. And I stand on my record in the last Parliament on an assessment of all of the MEPs across the political groups by 30 NGOs and organisations on environmental issues. Myself and Mick Wallace scored highest on all of those. And on my parliamentary record, I have been the rapporteur or shadow for my political group on more legislative files than all of the other Dublin MEPs put together. My speaking record is greater than all of the other Dublin MEPs put together. So I believe that I have been a voice challenging the geopolitical turbocharged nature of the European Commission under Ursula von der Leyen.
The two Irish MEPs, Claire Daly and Mick Wallace, have been under investigation by the Irish Times, insinuating that they're supporters of the policies coming from Russia and China. Do you see them getting re-elected?
The latest projections say that they're struggling, yes. They're certainly in contention, and those exit polls could have been very interesting. I'm kind of very interested to see how those particular MEPs do, but it's all to play for. I think we're going to have to see how those votes pan out and whether they do get transfers from other candidates.
So when are we expected to see the results from these elections?
Well, there's also local elections happening, and they'll start counting those votes tomorrow. Mm-hmm. The European election votes, they won't start counting them until Sunday. It's done by hand, and because of this proportionate representation system, you end up counting those votes quite a few times. So it is going to take a few days for the final results to come through, and there'll probably be some nail-biting competitions between a few potential MEPs and a few constituencies to see who gets those few critical transfer votes.
In a few months, there will be another election, a general election in Ireland. What can we expect on that?
There has to be a general election for a new national government by March 2025 at the latest. But of course, it is in the choice of the current government to have that sooner if they choose to. We don't want to speculate too much, but, Sinn Féin was the party that the current government was afraid of was going to take all those seats. However, if they're polling weekly at the moment, it must be quite tempting to some people within the current government to see perhaps they could bring forward those general elections. So it's too early to say and we shouldn't speculate, but I'm sure national politicians who are in government at the moment will be looking very closely at these election results.
And what are the main concerns of voters in Ireland?
Well, the media that was following the campaign and the feedback we've heard from candidates as well is that there was a couple of key issues. Migration was absolutely a discussion. While there is no far-right party in Ireland at the moment, the country has been grappling with the issue of migration, and there's been a very few very high-profile and quite disturbing in some cases incidences over the last couple of months. Mm-hmm. There were riots in the capital city in autumn of last year, provoked by a foreign national was mentally ill, kind of stabbing quite a number of people, and there was actually riots on the street which apparently did target people who were not Irish or not of Irish ethnicity as well. We've had instances where buildings in towns which were suspected of being reserved for asylum seekers, rightly or wrongly, were burned down to prevent that from happening. Mm-hmm. And in the last couple of weeks, we've had minor tent cities in Dublin city centre being, for asylum seekers, for migrants, being broken down by the police and then springing up at another location in a kind of a whack-a-mole type situation as well. Mm-hmm. So it's very much on the agenda. It's also linked to the reality that while Ireland has experienced tremendous economic growth over the last 20, 30 years, a central feature has been that the state has struggled to keep up in terms of providing public services, most notably health and housing.
Can you tell us, why is housing one of the main topics of discussion in Ireland?
There's no simple answer. I think if there was a simple answer, they would have solved it. I mean, there's a lot of history there as well. Mm-hmm. Ireland was building record amounts of housing and apartments in the build-up to the 2008 crisis. And then, of course, there was a huge oversupply. The building industry was decimated for several years. Many workers went to move abroad and stayed there as well. The country had a fairly rapid rebound and aggressive growth and a jump in the population as well, with a lot of inbound migration. So a huge increase in the need for housing a seeming inability to actually provide those houses. Now, people have blamed different things. They say that, for example, the planning system isn't fit for purpose. Individuals find it too easy to block homes from being built. Other people point out that quite a number of members of the Irish Parliament are landlords themselves, so perhaps they may not have a huge incentive to deliver on more housing. What we do see is that it's been a central feature of the current Irish government, which has been in power since 2020, and they have managed to ramp up the construction rates for new homes. But of course, these things take time, and it is in the context of still growing demand. So they're really trying to play catch up, really then to get on top and start to see housing prices going down.
Thank you very much, Donagh. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed or followed us yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. Also, make sure to leave a review or a comment on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work, and this episode was produced by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, Nicoleta Yunta, and myself. Thank you for tuning in, and until tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.